The first rule of survival in the desert is that you don't go looking for things that aren't on the map, but I was hungry, broke, and desperate enough to ignore the silence of the wasteland. I was working as a long-haul courier for off-the-books logistics, the kind of job where you don't ask what's in the crate, and you definitely don't ask why the delivery coordinates lead to a dry lake bed in the middle of a restricted Nevada grid. My GPS had been flickering for 3 hours, the screen bleeding a dull static blue before it finally died, leaving me with nothing but a handwritten compass heading, and a sense of dread that felt like cold lead in my stomach. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against the windshield of my aging rig. But as I crossed a ridge that wasn't marked on any geological survey, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in seconds. That was the first time I saw it. A massive, sprawling industrial complex carved directly into the throat of a jagged canyon, its surface covered in a matte black material that seemed to swallow the sunlight rather than reflect it. There were no flags, no branch insignias, and no signs of life. Yet the rhythmic, low-frequency hum vibrating through my steering Will told me the heart of this place was beating very fast. I pulled to a stop at a gate that looked like it had been forged from a single piece of dark iron. There was no intercom, no keypad, and no guard shack, just a smooth obsidian pillar with a single glass eye staring at my license plate. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't human, a gaze that felt heavy and clinical. To my horror, the massive gates began to slide open with a sound like grinding bone, despite me never uttering a word or presenting an ID. I should have turned around then. I should have pushed that truck into reverse until the tires blew, but my fuel gauge was sitting on a dead empty, and the desert behind me was a furnace of certain death. I drove forward, the shadows of the facility closing over the cab of my truck like the jaws of a prehistoric predator. As I entered the main courtyard, the scale of the place hit me. It wasn't just a base, it was a city of silence. Rows of identical, windowless barracks stretched into the gloom, all painted that same light-eating black, with no lights showing through any cracks. I stepped out of the truck, and the air tasted like ozone and old pennies, a metallic tang that made my teeth ache. I walked toward what looked like an administrative hub, my boots echoing too loudly against the pavement, the sound bouncing back to me with a strange, half-second delay that made it feel like someone was walking perfectly in step behind me. I turned around quickly, but the courtyard was empty, just my idling truck and the vast, oppressive walls. I reached the heavy steel door of the hub and found it slightly ajar, a sliver of fluorescent light spilling out onto the dark ground. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming in a way that sounded almost like a human vocalization, and stepped into a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and rotting flowers. The walls were lined with clipboards and duty rosters, but as I leaned in to read them, my blood ran cold. The dates were all current. Today's date was printed at the top of every sheet, but the names listed were all crossed out in thick, wet ink. At the bottom of the stack, a single name remained uncrossed. Mine. I backed away from the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was impossible. I had been hired by a shell company over an encrypted app, and no one was supposed to know I was coming here. I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the end of the hall, a wet, heavy sound, like a slab of meat hitting a concrete floor. I tried to call out, to ask if anyone was there, but my voice died in my throat as the lights overhead began to pulse in time with the thumping. Thump, pulse, thump, pulse. It was the heartbeat of the building, and it was getting faster. I ducked into a side room to hide, my breath coming in jagged gasps. The room was a mess of monitors and old reel-to-reel tapes, most of them spinning aimlessly. One screen was active, showing a graining black and white feed of the very hallway I had just been standing in. I watched the screen, paralyzed, as a figure emerged from the shadows where I had been seconds ago. It was wearing a high-altitude flight suit, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, reaching down past the knees, and the helmet's visor was cracked, revealing nothing but a shifting, oily darkness inside. The figure on the screen didn't move toward the room I was in. Instead, it turned and looked directly into the camera lens. I felt a cold surge of electricity shoot through my body as the creature, whatever it was, tilted its head at a 90-degree angle. On the desk next to the monitor, an old speaker crackled to life. It didn't play a voice, but but a recording of my own voice from 5 minutes ago, repeating the words I had thought but hadn't said. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. I realized then that this base wasn't abandoned. It was functioning exactly as intended, but the staff weren't biological anymore. I scrambled to the back of the room, looking for another exit, and found a heavy freight elevator with its doors pinned open by a discarded combat boot. The boot was still occupied by a foot, severed cleanly at the ankle, the skin a pale, waxy gray. I didn't scream. I didn't have the air for it. I just stepped over the grisly obstruction and slammed my fist into the down button, desperate to get away from the thing in the hallway. The elevator didn't go down. Instead, the floor fell away with a sickening lurch, dropping me into a vertical shaft that seemed to descend miles into the earth. As I fell, the walls of the shaft changed from concrete to a pulsing, organic material that looked like charred muscle. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and scorched hair. I gripped the handrail until my knuckles turned white, watching the floor numbers on the digital display scramble into symbols I didn't recognize. Mathematical equations that seemed to hurt my eyes to look at. When the elevator finally lurched to a halt, the doors didn't open. A voice whispered from the ceiling panels, a voice that sounded like 1,000 dead leaves scraping together. It called me by a nickname only my mother used, a name I hadn't heard in 20 years. You're late for your shift, the voice rasped, followed by a wet, clicking sound. The doors began to groan as something on the other side started to peel them apart with claws that sounded like knives on a chalkboard. The metal doors shrieked as they were peeled back like a tin can, revealing not a hallway, but a vast, underground hangar that stretched further than my eyes could see. The air down here was freezing, a dry, sterile cold that made my lungs burn with every panic breath. Thousands of black spheres, each about the size of a car, were suspended in midair by shimmering threads of translucent blue light. They hummed in a low, dissonant chord that vibrated in my teeth, a sound that felt like it was trying to rewrite my DNA. I stumbled out of the elevator, my legs shaking so violently I nearly collapsed. Behind me, the elevator door snapped shut, the metal fused together as if it had never been opened, leaving me trapped in a subterranean graveyard of technology that shouldn't exist. I began to run, but there was no direction that felt safe. The floor was etched with glowing circuits that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly green light, guiding me deeper into the heart of the complex. I passed workstations where people were sitting, but as I got closer, I saw they weren't people at all. They were husks, human bodies hollowed out and filled with the same matte black material that covered the base's exterior. Their fingers moved with mechanical precision over consoles made of liquid light, typing out strings of code that looked like ancient ruins. They didn't look up as I passed. They didn't have eyes to look with. The deeper I went, the more the reality of the base began to fracture. I walked past a glass observation room and stopped dead. Inside, my own truck was parked. It wasn't the truck I had driven in. It was a version of it that had been dismantled and reassembled into something nightmarish. The engine had been replaced by a pulsing, fleshy mass, and the seats were covered in what looked like human hair. I felt a wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to lean against the wall. This place wasn't just hidden. It was consuming the world outside, taking familiar things and turning them into something wrong. Suddenly, the overhead hum stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made my ears bleed. From the shadows of the floating spheres, a figure stepped out. It was wearing a high-ranking military uniform, the fabric pristine and sharp, but the face above the collar was a blurred smear of static, like a censored image in a documentary. It held a silver tray with a single glass of water. "You've been walking for a long time," the static-faced man said, his voice coming from the air around me rather than his mouth. "You must be thirsty." I backed away, tripping over a cable that felt like a wet snake. I didn't want the water. I didn't want anything but the sun and the sand. As I scrambled to my feet, the officer's face flared with a bright, angry red static. The temperature in the room spiked to a boiling heat, and the water in the glass began to boil instantly, shattering the vessel. "Insubordination is a terminal offense." The voice boomed, now sounding like a choir of screaming machines. I turned and bolted into a side corridor, my heart feeling like it was going to burst through my ribs. The corridor led me to a biological storage wing. Huge vats of amber liquid lined the walls, and inside each one was a different person. I recognized them. These were the names from the list. The people who had disappeared on the desert roads over the last 50 years. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, tracking my movement to the glass with a look of pure, unadulterated agony. One woman pressed her hand against the glass as I ran past, her skin peeling away like wet paper. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to warn me. I found a terminal that was partially smashed, its screen flickering with a map of the facility. I realized I was nearly 5 miles underground. The base wasn't built by the government. It was a parasite that had grown beneath the desert, mimicking a military installation to lure in the desperate and forgotten. It used our logic, our architecture, and our fears to build a cage we would walk into willingly. The map showed a single red line leading to a ventilation shaft, my only hope of reaching the surface. As I reached the shaft, the lights in the entire wing turned a deep blood red. A siren began to wail, but it wasn't a mechanical alarm. It sounded like a human being screaming at the top of their lungs, amplified 1,000 times. The floor beneath me began to tilt, the organic material of the walls groaning. As it started to constrict, the base was waking up, and it knew there was a foreign cell in its body. It was trying to digest me. I climbed into the ventilation duct, the metal burning my palms. I could hear something crawling in the pipes behind me, a skittering, multi-legged sound that moved with terrifying speed. Every time I looked back, I saw a flash of white bone or a glint of a cracked visor. It was a thing from the elevator, the long-armed pilot, and it was mimicking the sound of my own panicked breathing to mock me. Almost there, it whispered in my own voice, the sound echoing to the metal vent. Just a little further, I reached a vertical ladder that seemed to go up forever. I climbed until my muscles screamed and my fingernails tore, leaving bloody streaks on the rungs. Above me, I could see a faint, flickering light, the moon. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't the moon. It was a giant, lidless eye peering down the shaft, its pupil a swirling vortex of the same black smoke I had seen earlier. The eye blinked, and the entire shaft shook with the force of a massive heartbeat. I was looking into the face of the thing that owned the desert. I reached the top of the ladder and threw myself through a hatch, gasping for air. I expected to see the desert, the stars, and my truck. Instead, I found myself in a room that was a perfect replica of my own childhood bedroom. Everything was exactly where I left it 20 years ago, but the window didn't look out onto the street. It looked out into an endless, black void. On the bed sat a figure with its back to me, holding a photo of my family. It turned around, and its face was a mirror, reflecting my own terrified expression back at me. "Welcome home," it said, and the walls of the room began to bleed. The reflection in the mirror face didn't just show my fear. It began to distort, my own features stretching and melting until I looked like the hollowed-out husks I had seen in the hangar. I didn't stay to watch the transformation finish. I threw a heavy glass lamp at the mirror entity, the sound of breaking glass echoing like a gunshot in a vacuum, and I sprinted to the only door in the room. I wasn't in a bedroom anymore. I was back in the matte black corridors, but the geometry was failing. The floor felt like soft, wet velvet, and the walls were leaning inward at impossible angles, whispering secrets in languages that made my brain feel like it was being scrubbed with sandpaper. I realized then that the base wasn't just a place. It was a digestive system, and I was the last piece of grit it couldn't quite break down. I burst through a final set of double doors and found myself on the roof of the main facility. The night sky above Nevada wasn't black. It was a swirling, bruised purple, and the stars were moving in synchronized mechanical patterns that felt like a countdown. Below me, the non-existent base was sprawling out, its silhouette shifting and growing like a mole colony. Thousands of those black spheres were rising from the hangars, floating silently into the atmosphere like a swarm of predatory spores. I looked for my truck, but all I saw was a pile of rusted scrap metal that looked like it had been sitting in the sun for 50 years. Time didn't work here. I had been inside for an hour, but the world I knew was already decaying. A low, guttural vibration shook the roof, nearly throwing me off the edge. From the center of the complex, a massive tower began to telescope upward, its surface covered in twitching, translucent human limbs fused into the metal. At the very top, a searchlight ignited, but it didn't cast light. It cast shadow. A beam of pure darkness swept across the desert, and wherever it touched, the ground vanished, leaving behind a static-filled void. I realized the base wasn't just hiding. It was deleting the world bit by bit and replacing it with this nightmare. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a cold, heavy weight that didn't feel like fingers, but like a cluster of wet stones. I turned to see the pilot again, the one with the cracked visor. It didn't attack me. It handed me a rusted set of keys, the keys to my truck. "The exit is a dream," it whispered, the voice now a perfect, haunting mimicry of my own father's voice. "If you stop running, you become the dream." The creature's visor shattered completely, revealing that there was no head inside the suit, only a miniature, swirling galaxy of that same oily black smoke. It pointed toward the perimeter fence, where a single, flickering neon sign for a gas station appeared out of the void like a hallucination. It was the last piece of my reality left, and it was fading fast. I leapt from the roof, my body hitting the soft, organic ground with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. I didn't care about broken bones. I scrambled toward the neon sign, my lungs screaming as the ozone air turned into thick, black sludge. The bass behind me let out a final, world-ending roar, a sound of metal twisting and spirits wailing in unison. The ground began to dissolve into static beneath my feet. I was running on nothing, a bridge of pure willpower over an infinite abyss. Every step I took, the real world felt further away, like a memory I was forgetting as I lived it. I reached the neon sign and collapsed against the pole. It was real. It was cold, hard metal, and buzzing electricity. I looked back, expecting to see the canyon and the black base, but there was nothing. Just the empty, moonlit Nevada desert. No facility, no spheres, no towers. My truck was parked a few yards away, looking exactly as it had when I started the trip. For a second, I thought I had imagined it all, a heat-induced psychotic break. But when I looked at my hands, they weren't covered in desert dust. They were stained with that thick, oily black fluid, and my fingernails were still torn and bloody from the latter. I crawled into the cab of my truck and started the engine. It roared to life, but the radio didn't play music. It played the sound of 1,000 dead leaves scraping together. I looked in the rear-view mirror to back out, and I froze. My reflection wasn't there. The mirror showed the interior of the truck, the empty seat, the dashboard, but where my face should have been, there was only a blur of gray television static. I reached up to touch my face, and my fingers didn't meet skin. They met something cold, flat, and vibrating with a low-frequency hum. I drove. I didn't stop until I reached a diner 300 miles away. I walked into the light, hoping someone would scream, hoping someone would tell me I was a monster. But the waitress just smiled and asked if I wanted coffee. She looked right at my face and didn't see the static. She didn't see the void. That's when the true horror settled into my marrow. The base hadn't let me escape. It had finished its work. I wasn't a survivor. I was a carrier. I looked down at the coffee cup, and the liquid inside began to pulse in time with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, desperate to scrub the black oil away. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, but the oil didn't come off. It started to sink into my pores, turning my veins black. I looked into the bathroom mirror, and for a split second, the static cleared. I didn't see myself. I saw the hangar. I saw the thousands of spheres. I saw the static-faced officer saluting me. I realized then that the base didn't need to exist on a map, because it now existed inside every person I passed, a silent infection waiting for the signal to wake up. I walked back out to my truck, the desert wind howling like a wounded animal. The GPS on my dashboard flickered back to life, but it didn't show the highway. It showed a single blinking red in the middle of a restricted grid, and a message scrolled across the screen in my own handwriting. Maintenance complete. System update in progress. I looked up at the moon, and for the first time, I saw the pupil in the center of it blink. The world is a beautiful lie, and I am the one who helped pull the curtain. I'm writing this because I don't have much time left before the static takes my voice too. If you're reading this and you see a black truck on a desert road, don't wave, don't stop, and for the love of God, Don't look at the driver, because if you see the static, it means the base has finally found you too. They told me the base didn't exist, but the terrifying truth is that now, nothing else does.